When making people redundant in New Zealand, the law treats this as a firing. Because we treat redundancy and dismissal the same way, the same rule for both situations applies when deciding whether the employee could have been let go. But obviously, making someone redundant and dismissing someone can be justified depending on the situation. So is it reasonable when you're making people redundant to choose the person you think would be cheapest to get rid of? Maybe not, according to Grace Team Accounting and Break, our most important case on redundancy, when the Court of Appeal explained how you figure out when making someone redundant is justified. Before this decision, the law had been where the courts were satisfied a person was made redundant for genuine business reasons, the court wouldn't question whether those reasons were reasonable themselves. Now, if you make someone redundant, the court can look into the information you used to figure out they would be the best choice and decide whether it was reasonable you made that decision. So what happened here? Miss Brake was hired by Grace Team Accounting in October of 2009 to replace a staff member on paternal leave. She was told at this time that her position would be long-term. Not long after this, however, Grace Team Accounting noticed that there was a bit of a cash flow problem and looked into that. What they found, however, was that they were going to make a loss of about $120,000 unless something was done. Or so they thought. In reality, they had thought this because of a prediction in their yearly earnings that was wrong by about $120,000. This was especially problematic for Grace Team Accounting as they, as accountants, had prepared the prediction themselves. To sort themselves out, Grace Team Accounting decided to make some positions redundant, and Miss Brake's was to be one of them. Of the 3 total employees to be made redundant, the other 2 accepted that they weren't needed and agreed to leave. However, things became more problematic when in April 2010, shortly after Grace Team started looking into making people redundant, Miss Brake asked for sick leave to visit the hospital, as unfortunately she had been diagnosed with leukemia and required treatment, but assured Grace Team Accounting not to worry as she was recovering. This was not known to Grace Team Accounting until she told them. Later that day then, Miss Brake was called into a meeting to be told that she was being made redundant. Importantly, Grace Team had already decided to make Miss Brake redundant before being told of her condition, but that didn't stop the meeting causing Miss Brake to make the connection that it might have been. Predictably, this made Miss Brake quite upset. Miss Brake raised a personal grievance for unjustified redundancy dismissal accordingly. So what did the court find here? Firstly, the case went to the Employment Relations Authority, where it was found that the decision to make Miss Brake redundant was justifiable with the information that was available to Grace Team Accounting at the time of the decision. Miss Brake appealed this decision, saying that it would have been unjustifiable had Grace Team Accounting done the math right. The Employment Court agreed with it, finding that there were 3 big areas where there was a problem for Grace Team Accounting. Firstly, that Grace Team Accounting, having only realised they were in financial trouble after hiring Miss Brake, did not know how well or how bad they were doing. This made the decision to hire Miss Brake irresponsible, especially because they had tempted her away from her last job by telling her the position would be long-term, but they couldn't guarantee that without knowing their finances. Secondly, that they had made Miss Brake redundant on the grounds that they thought they were in fact far worse off, when there was no real evidence to back that up. Thirdly, that Grace Team Accounting couldn't show why it was they had begun considering Miss Brake for redundancy on top of the other 2 positions who had already agreed to be let go. All of that led the Employment Court to find that Grace Team Accounting had not done what a fair and reasonable employer could have done, as a reasonable employer would not have made those errors. Grace Team Accounting didn't agree, arguing that the court had overstepped by saying the reasonable employer had to be anything more than an employer who had made a reasonable decision with the information in front of them, and appealed the decision one step further to the Court of Appeal. The Court of Appeal did not accept Grace Team Accounting's argument, and backed up the Employment Court's decision. Why? Just because an employer argues that what they decided was reasonable, doesn't mean that the court is just going to accept that. Instead, it is now up to the courts to look at the information used and decide whether that would be something a reasonable employer would have relied upon. Here, this was not the case, and so Grace Team Accounting was required to pay out for the personal grievance. So what did the court give Miss Brake? Miss Brake was given 12 months' salary for the dismissal, totaling $65,000, as she was put out of work, was denied a position back at her old place of work, and could provide evidence that she'd been unsuccessful in finding another job during the time of the case. Miss Brake was also awarded a further $20,000 for emotional strain she was put under given the way in which the dismissal was carried out. So what are the important bits of law here? The most important thing to note is that when making someone redundant in New Zealand, your employer must make sure that the information they are using to decide whether to make people redundant and who is going to be made redundant is accurate information. Otherwise, an employer opens themselves up to a personal grievance. Also, there is no easy checklist for what the employer should have as far as information goes. The court will look into each personal grievance in front of them to decide if, in that situation, the information used was reasonable. Lastly, while not necessarily with regards to redundancy law, the court also increased the payout to Miss Brake in this case based on the fact that the employer had decided to fire her on the same day she opened up about her leukemia. This caused significant distress, and so the court was willing to order more compensation on top of lost wages for the poor way the employer handled the situation, which caused distress.